I never thought betrayal could sound so soft. Just 4 little words whispered against my ear. "Hope you can swim, sis." That is what my younger sister said right before her manicured hands shoved me off the deck of a yacht into the dark waters of Miami Bay. The shock of the fall still burns in my memory. The sting of salt, the sudden silence, the cruel laughter fading above me. And what cut deeper than the push was the smile I saw on my husband's face. Ethan Walker, the man who once promised forever, stood by her side, his lips curled into something colder than any ocean current. They thought that night was my ending, but the truth is, it was only the beginning. When they returned home, draped in their fake grief and rehearsed sorrow, I was waiting, with something they never expected. But before you understand why that night changed everything, I need to take you back to the start, back to Cleveland, Ohio, where 2 sisters grew up under the same roof, yet in 2 very different worlds. My name is Cassandra Morgan, but most people call me Cassie. I was the studious one, the kind of kid who preferred library books to high school dances. While other girls were practicing cheer routines, I was taking apart old computers, fascinated by the way code could solve problems faster than people ever could. I worked nights at the hospital cafeteria, pouring coffee for weary doctors, and spent my breaks scribbling ideas into a battered notebook. My sister Rachel was different. She was dazzling, magnetic, the girl who walked into a room and made the air change. By the time she was 16, she had already won 6 beauty pageants across Ohio. My parents, both factory workers, believed she was destined for something greater. "Rachel's our ticket," I used to overhear them whisper. "If she can just get to Los Angeles, everything will change." What no one noticed was the way I quietly built my own escape plan. It was not through sequins and tiaras, but through code. In college, I poured myself into an idea: software that could listen to a person's voice and detect early signs of illness. It sounded impossible, even foolish at the time, but I believed in it with every ounce of my being. The contrast between us was sharp. At family dinners, Rachel would talk about modeling contracts, while I would try to explain algorithms. My father would smile at her stories, nodding with pride, while my words hung in the air like static no one wanted to tune into. And yet, I kept going. I always believed that if I just worked harder, if I just proved myself, the spotlight might shift. Even for a second. By the time I turned 35, I had already built and sold my company, Mediscan AI, for $850 million. The same girl who once cleaned tables at midnight now sat across from investors in glass towers, negotiating contracts that would change the healthcare industry. On paper, I had everything: a successful company, a husband who seemed to believe in me, and yes, even a reconciled relationship with Rachel, or so I thought. What I did not realize, what I could not let myself imagine, was that the very people I loved most were sharpening their knives behind my back. And on that glittering Miami night, under the hum of champagne laughter and the sway of luxury waves, those knives would finally cut deep. If you are watching this, tell me in the comments where you are listening from. It amazes me how stories of family, betrayal, and survival echo across every state, every town, every porch where folks sit and remember the past. Now let me take you back to mine, because my story didn't start on a yacht in Miami. It started in a modest 2-bedroom house on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, where the smell of factory grease clung to my father's jacket, and the rhythm of my mother's sewing machine was the soundtrack of our lives. Rachel and I shared a room until I was 17. She was 4 years younger, but somehow she always felt older. Maybe it was her confidence, maybe the way people leaned in when she spoke. Rachel sparkled, even when she didn't try. blonde curls, wide smile, that kind of beauty people swore was heaven sent. By the time she hit high school, every pageant director within 50 miles knew her name. And me? I was the quiet one. Glasses slipping down my nose, notebooks stuffed with computer code I barely understood myself. I mopped floors at the hospital after class, and when my shift ended, I would sit in the break room, watching patients and nurses, thinking about how voices carried secrets. A cough, a tremor, a pause. I scribbled equations, dreaming of a program that could hear sickness before it was visible. No one in my family asked about my ideas. They were too busy polishing Rachel's trophies. I still remember one winter night. The furnace broke, and we all huddled under blankets. My dad turned to Rachel, telling her how her next pageant win might help pay for a better house someday. Then he looked at me and said, "Cassie, don't forget to set the alarm. You've got the early shift." His words weren't cruel, just matter of fact. In that moment, I realized the roles had been cast. Rachel was the dream. I was the duty. But here is the twist most people don't see. That kind of neglect, it doesn't just crush you. Sometimes, it forges you. While Rachel soaked in applause, I learned discipline. While she practiced poses, I practiced persistence. I wasn't anyone's ticket out, so I had to build my own door. College was where things shifted. I earned a scholarship, though my parents half joked it was because no one else applied. I didn't care. At the campus library, I found old medical journals, and with every late night, I stitched together the skeleton of what would become Metascan AI. People doubted me, professors dismissed me, but doubt was something I already knew well. Meanwhile, Rachel's path was brighter on the surface, but messier underneath. She moved to Los Angeles for modeling, came back broke, then tried acting, then sales. Each time she failed, my parents comforted her with warm meals and soft words. Each time I succeeded, whether it was a coding award or a new internship, the reaction was mild, as though they feared celebrating me might dim her light. Looking back now, I see how those years shaped everything that followed. My ambition wasn't born out of arrogance, it was born out of hunger. The hunger to be seen, to be heard, to prove that my worth wasn't negotiable. Rachel had beauty queens handing her roses. I had sleepless nights and a laptop that overheated. And still, I pressed on. What none of us could have imagined was that my determination would one day build a fortune big enough to change all of our lives. And that very fortune, the one meant to secure a future for all of us, would become the weapon Rachel and Ethan turned against me. They say success changes everything. But sometimes, it only changes the masks people wear. By the time I turned 30, I had poured every ounce of myself into Metascan AI. My apartment was a shoebox, my meals were cheap takeout, and my wardrobe was 2 steps above thrift store racks. But my program was working. Metascan could analyze a patient's voice, compare it against thousands of data points, and flag early signs of neurological disease. Doctors who once brushed me off were suddenly calling me a pioneer. Investors, however, were another story. They wanted flashy teams from Stanford or MIT, not a girl from Cleveland who had bags under her eyes and debt collectors on her voicemail. That's when Ethan Walker entered my life. I first saw him at a startup conference in Austin, Texas. The room was full of men in tailored suits and women rehearsing their elevator pitches, but Ethan moved differently. He was tall, with that New York polish, the kind of presence that made you think he already owned the room. After my panel, he introduced himself. "Your work is going to change healthcare," he said, as if it was a fact, not a compliment. He asked questions no one else asked, not just about profits, but about purpose. I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. Within months, we were inseparable. Ethan brought flowers to my tiny office, took me to dinners where the waiters knew his name, whispered promises of a life we would build together. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe love could be more than distraction. Less than a year later, he proposed under the lantern lights of a rooftop in New York. I said yes through tears, my heart convinced I had found the partner who would honor every sacrifice I had made. Rachel was my maid of honor. She wept through her toast, clutching my hand at the reception. "You deserve this, sis," she told me, and I believed her. For one fragile moment, I thought my family was whole. The years that followed felt like a whirlwind. My company grew faster than I ever imagined. Clinical trials turned into hospital partnerships, and hospital partnerships turned into buyout offers. I remember the morning we signed the deal. $850 million. A number so big, it barely felt real. My hands shook as I wrote my signature, as though the pen itself knew it was changing history. That night, Ethan threw a celebration in our San Diego mansion. Champagne flowed, lights sparkled, and guests toasted me as though I were royalty. I should have felt untouchable, triumphant. But in the middle of all the glitter and laughter, I noticed something odd. Across the room, Ethan and Rachel stood together near the fireplace. It wasn't what they said, though they leaned in close, whispering. But the look. A flicker of understanding passed between them, one I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I brushed it aside at first. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe my exhaustion was twisting shadows into shapes that weren't there. But the feeling lingered like smoke in the air, unseen yet impossible to breathe through. Here's the twist. The night I thought marked my victory was actually the night my downfall began. Because while I was raising a glass to a future I believed was safe, Ethan and Rachel were already planting the seeds of betrayal. I didn't know it yet, but the wealth I worked for would not only draw predators, it had already invited them into my home. At first, the changes were small, almost invisible. Ethan started working later, claiming New York demanded more of his time. He locked his laptop when I walked into the room, something he never used to do. His phone, once left on the counter without thought, now lived in his pocket like a secret he carried everywhere. When I asked, he smiled and kissed my forehead. "Just business, Cassie. Nothing to worry about." But worry has a way of settling in your bones when you've lived a life of being overlooked. Then Rachel reappeared. She called one morning, voice trembling, talking about how Los Angeles had chewed her up and spit her out. She needed a place to stay, just for a little while. Against my better judgment, I opened the doors of our San Diego mansion. After all, she was my sister. Family, I told myself, always comes first. But soon, her little while stretched into weeks. I would come downstairs to find Rachel and Ethan laughing together in the kitchen over coffee I hadn't brewed. They began taking trips to the mall, returning with inside jokes I wasn't part of. At dinner, they exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. I told myself it was harmless, that I was imagining shadows where none existed. But deep down, a knot was forming, one that tightened with every passing day. One evening, after another tense dinner, I walked into my home office and opened the router logs. It was a habit from my coding days, checking digital fingerprints, tracing activity. That's when I saw it. Multiple logins from Ethan's devices to encrypted banking sites I didn't recognize. Offshore accounts. Transfer searches for amounts so large my breath caught. Hundreds of millions. The kind of money you don't just move, you disappear with. I couldn't sleep after that. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest. Memories replayed in my head. The whispered exchange at the celebration. The secretive smiles. Suddenly, the pieces didn't look random anymore. They looked like a puzzle snapping into place. I hired a private investigator, Mark Dalton, an old detective known for his discretion. Within weeks, he returned with a file thick enough to break me in two. Ethan had a past I never fully knew. Reckless investments, failed hedge funds, debts buried deep under polished charm. Rachel's story was no cleaner. Behind the pageant crowns and photo shoots, she had spiraled into credit card debt so massive it could drown her twice over. And now they had found a solution. Me. But the worst discovery came when I installed hidden cameras in Ethan's home office. I remember sitting alone in the glow of the monitor, my hands shaking as the feed flickered to life. There they were, Ethan and Rachel, sitting close, their voices low, but their intentions sharp. They weren't talking about bills or business. They were talking about me. About insurance policies, legal loopholes, inheritance rights. And then, chillingly, about an accident that would leave Rachel as my rightful heir. Hearing my own sister, the girl who once held my hand in the dark when storms rattled our windows, calmly plotting my death, it hollowed me out. It wasn't jealousy anymore. It wasn't neglect. It was something far darker. Here's the twist most people miss. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles at you across the dinner table. Sometimes it wears the faces you love most. And sometimes those faces are already picturing the world without you in it. When Ethan suggested a getaway, I almost laughed. "Just the two of us," he said, his voice dripping with practiced warmth. "We've both been working so hard. We deserve something special." He painted a picture of turquoise water, balmy nights, champagne on the deck of a private yacht. A celebration of our love, he called it. To anyone else, it might have sounded romantic. To me, it sounded like bait. And then, as if fate itself wanted to confirm my suspicion, Rachel called a day later. "Guess what, Cassie?" she chirped. "Ethan invited me along too. Isn't that sweet? A family trip." My stomach dropped. A family trip. On a yacht. In open water. The pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. But I didn't let them see me flinch. I smiled. I nodded. I agreed. And quietly, I began to prepare. I tucked a waterproof pouch inside my luggage, packed with a GPS tracker, a satellite phone the size of a lighter, and emergency cash. I moved a portion of my fortune into an account only I could reach. If Ethan and Rachel thought I was walking blindly into their trap, they were the ones blind to me. The yacht was everything Ethan promised. Sleek, white, gleaming under the Miami sun. The crew greeted us with polite smiles, but by nightfall, Rachel made sure they were gone. "Take the night off," she told them with a sweetness that hid steel underneath. "We'll manage just fine." Dinner was served on the upper deck. Candlelight flickered, glasses clinked, and the ocean stretched endless and black around us. Ethan poured the wine, his hand steady, his smile smooth. Too smooth. The liquid shimmered ruby red in my glass, but when I lifted it to my lips, I paused. A faint bitterness clung to the rim, something that didn't belong. I let the wine touch my tongue, then set the glass down with a deliberate sigh. "I think the sea air is making me dizzy," I murmured, letting my body sway just enough. Ethan's eyes gleamed. Rachel leaned closer. The performance had begun. I stretched out on a lounge chair, feigning drowsiness. My breath slowed. My eyelids fluttered. I let them believe the drug, or what they thought was a drug, was working. And in that haze of feigned weakness, I heard it. Their voices, sharp against the lull of the waves. "Tonight's the night," Ethan whispered. Rachel giggled, a sound so childlike it chilled me. "By morning, she'll be gone. And everything she built, ours." I wanted to scream, to confront them, to demand why. But instead, I waited, because the truth is, sometimes silence is the strongest weapon. And then it happened. Rachel rose, her heels clicking softly against the deck. She leaned over me, her perfume sickly sweet, her breath hot against my ear. "Hope you can swim, sis," she whispered. Then with one sudden shove, the world tilted, and I was swallowed by black water. The ocean hit me like ice. Salt seared my throat as I kicked against the weight pulling me down. Above, the yacht's lights blurred, shrinking into stars. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard laughter. Or maybe it was just the roar of blood in my ears. Here's the truth I carried with me into that water. They thought they had written my ending, but what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that the story was just beginning. The water was black and endless, pressing against my chest like a weight determined to break me. Panic clawed at my throat as I kicked upward, my arms slicing through the waves. Every breath was a battle. The yacht's lights blurred above me, smaller and smaller, until they vanished entirely. For a moment, I thought that was it, that I would die in the same ocean that had witnessed my sister's betrayal. But survival is a strange thing. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And that night, it whispered to me, "Move, breathe, fight." I clung to the waterproof pouch strapped to my body like it was a lifeline. Inside it, the GPS beacon blinked faintly, a tiny heartbeat in the darkness. My lungs burned, but I forced myself into a rhythm, recalling every lesson from my college swim team. Stroke, breathe, stroke, breathe. Hours bled together, the horizon offering no mercy, no land, only water and the ache in my muscles. Sometime before dawn, a beam of light swept across the waves. A fishing vessel, old, rust-streaked, Cuban by the flag at its mast. Rough hands pulled me aboard, and I collapsed on the wooden deck, coughing seawater until my chest heaved raw. They didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. To them, I was just a half-drowned woman clinging to life. To me, they were angels disguised in oil-stained boots. When the boat reached Key West, I slipped into the shadows before dawn, a ghost in borrowed clothes. Cassie Morgan, millionaire tech founder, was gone. In her place stood Claire Davis, a name I plucked from a street sign and wore like armor. I found shelter in a quiet town in the Florida Keys, the kind of place where tourists snapped pictures of pelicans while locals kept their heads down. I rented a room above a bait shop, cash only, and lived like someone who had never owned more than a few dollars. The world believed Cassandra Morgan had been lost to the sea. Ethan and Rachel even held a press conference, crocodile tears shining under TV lights as they begged for closure. I sat in that cramped little room, watching them weep for the cameras, my fists clenched so tight my nails carved crescents into my palms. They thought the ocean had swallowed me. They thought the fortune was theirs to divide. They thought wrong. Because if betrayal had taught me anything, it was patience. I still had resources. I still had allies. Quietly, I reached out. First was Harold Price, my lawyer, a man with more steel in his spine than most judges. He didn't flinch when I called from a burner phone. Then came Emily Tran, a cybersecurity expert who owed me a favor from a grant I once funded. Finally, I brought Mark Dalton back into the fold, the private investigator who had already proven he could dig up the filth others tried to bury. We met in motels and diners, places where no one would remember a face. I laid out the plan not as a victim, but as a strategist. Collect evidence, track movements, expose fraud, and when the time was right, make my return in a way they could never erase. The woman who nearly drowned that night in Miami had been naive. She believed family meant loyalty, that love meant safety. But the woman who rose from that ocean? She was something else entirely. Here's the twist they never saw coming. I wasn't running anymore. I was preparing. The night I returned to San Diego, the mansion didn't feel like mine anymore. Its walls had once echoed with laughter, with late-night brainstorming sessions, with dreams spoken over glasses of wine. Now it felt like a stage, and I was ready to play my part. I arrived before sunset, my team already in place. Emily had hacked the security system so that every camera fed directly to our servers. Mark stationed 2 plainclothes men in the driveway, while Harold waited nearby with documents folded neatly in a leather case. I walked through the front door as if I had never left, switched on every light, and let the house glow like a lantern. Then I set the table. It was almost absurd, the effort I put into it. A bottle of Bordeaux, 3 crystal glasses, silver polished to a mirror shine. At the center, a small gift box wrapped in black ribbon. To anyone else, it might have looked festive, even welcoming. To me, it was a fuse. The clock struck 11 when I heard the gates open. Tires on gravel. Laughter floating in from the driveway. They were back from Europe, no doubt drunk on designer vacations and the false security of believing me dead. The front door opened, and their voices carried in. Rachel's high-pitched giggle, Ethan's smooth baritone. Then silence. Because they saw me. I was standing at the head of the table, the chandelier throwing light across my face. My hair pulled back, my posture steady, every ounce of fear burned away in the weeks since Miami. "Welcome home," I said softly, my voice cutting through the quiet. "Miss me?" Rachel's purse slipped from her hand, scattering cosmetics across the marble floor. Ethan froze, his expression a war between disbelief and fury. For a heartbeat, none of us moved. Then I gestured to the table. "Sit. Dinner's waiting." They didn't sit. They whispered. Ethan's jaw clenched. Rachel trembled, but her eyes darted to the box in the center like it might detonate. "It's for you," I told them. "A gift. Open it." Ethan's hand twitched, but it was Rachel who finally lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked flash drives and printed papers. On top, a photograph still frame from the hidden cameras. Ethan and Rachel side by side, discussing my accident. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan cursed under his breath. "There's more," I said. "Bank transfers, offshore accounts, fraudulent contracts. Oh, and that little video of you both planning my death?" I leaned forward. "It's already with the FBI. Tonight isn't about evidence. Tonight is about watching the look on your faces as you realize the game is over." Ethan snapped. He grabbed the steak knife from the table, lunging across the room with a roar. For a moment, it was all motion. His footsteps pounding, Rachel screaming, the glint of steel. But before he could reach me, Mark's men burst in. The blade clattered to the floor as Ethan was pinned, cuffed, and dragged back. Seconds later, uniformed officers swarmed the room. Rachel collapsed, sobbing, mascara streaking her cheeks. "Cassie, please!" she begged, crawling toward me. "I didn't mean it. It was Ethan. He made me—" I looked down at her, the sister who once whispered comfort in our childhood room, now begging like a stranger. "Remember when you told me to swim?" My voice was steady, cold. "The sharks are waiting for you now." The officers lifted her up, her wrists bound in silver bracelets that matched Ethan's. For the first time, I felt the house exhale. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen. But I wasn't the same woman who walked onto that stage. The weeks that followed felt like living in a dream I didn't choose. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, their microphones thrust like spears, their questions buzzing louder than the cicadas in the California heat. Is it true your husband and sister plotted to kill you? What will you do with your fortune now? Every camera lens searched for tears, for drama, for weakness. But I stood tall, not because I was unshaken, but because I refused to let them see me broken again. Ethan's trial was first. The prosecutors laid everything bare: his debts, his fake accounts, his desperate plan to inherit through my death. The jury needed less than 3 hours. 35 years in federal prison. No parole. When the sentence was read, Ethan looked at me once, his eyes burning not with regret, but with hatred. It was the last time our eyes would ever meet. Rachel's trial came next, and that was the wound I thought might never close. Her lawyer painted her as manipulated, a woman swept into Ethan's schemes. But the recordings told a different story. Her laugh as she whispered, "Hope you can swim, sis." Her eagerness to discuss inheritance rights. Her signature on fraudulent transfers. The court sentenced her to 20 years. She broke down sobbing, calling my name as if we were children again, begging me to say something, anything. I didn't. Justice, in its cold efficiency, did what I could not. It gave me space to breathe. I sold the mansion in San Diego within a month. Too many ghosts lingered in those walls, too many echoes of laughter that had turned to betrayal. Instead, I bought a modest apartment in Los Angeles with wide windows and no locked doors. For the first time, I lived somewhere that didn't feel like a stage, but like a sanctuary. Money no longer felt like armor. It felt like responsibility. I created the Rising Tide Foundation, named for the very ocean that tried to take me. Its mission was simple: to help victims of financial abuse and family betrayal rebuild their lives. Women who had been drained by spouses, children abandoned by parents who gambled away their inheritance, siblings crushed under the weight of favoritism. I listened to their stories, and in their pain, I found mirrors of my own. But there was one thing left I had to do. I visited Rachel in prison. It wasn't forgiveness I carried with me, but finality. When she walked into the visiting room, her beauty was gone, stripped away by orange cloth and hollow eyes. She sat across from me, hands trembling. "Cassie," she whispered, "I don't expect you to forgive me. But please, don't hate me forever." I looked at her, my sister, my betrayer, the girl who once braided my hair before school, and I told her the truth. "I don't hate you, Rachel. Hatred ties me to you, and I need to be free. But I will never forgive you. Not because I can't, but because you never asked for forgiveness when it mattered." She wept. I didn't. I stood and walked away, leaving her tears behind like the tide leaves shells on the sand. Months later, I found myself on the Pacific coast, standing on a small fishing boat. The sea stretched wide and merciless, the same sea that once tried to claim me. In my hands, I held a bouquet of white lilies. Slowly, I released them, watching as the flowers drifted out, carried by the current. "The woman who fell that night is gone," I whispered to the waves. "The one standing here was reborn." And in that moment, I understood something deeper than survival. Betrayal had not defined me, nor had money, nor even justice. What defined me was the choice I made every morning after, to rise again and again, like a tide that refuses to stay low. Because life will always have its oceans. Some nights they'll try to drown you. Some days they'll look endless. But if you keep moving, if you keep fighting, eventually you'll rise above the waves. That's what I did, and maybe, just maybe, that's what you can do too.